It was supposed to be a simple, peaceful getaway. My friend Mason had convinced me to join him on a camping trip in the forest just outside of town. He knew a spot, a place deep in the woods where no one else ever ventured. It wasn't the kind of trip I'd usually take. I'm more of a stay-home and watch a movie kind of person, but I had been feeling stressed from work, and the idea of disconnecting for a couple of days sounded appealing. The drive to the campsite was long, the road winding deeper and deeper and deeper into the woods. The trees grew taller and denser, their branches reaching over the narrow dirt road like skeletal arms. Mason was in high spirits, chatting about the different trails we could hike and how peaceful it would be without the usual distractions of the modern world. I tried to match his enthusiasm, but as we got further from civilization, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. When we arrived at the campsite, the sun was just starting to set. The clearing was small, surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush. It was beautiful in a remote kind of way, the air crisp with the smell of pine and earth. There was a small stream nearby, the water gently trickling over rocks. Mason set up the tent while I gathered firewood, and by the time darkness fell, we had a fire crackling and the stars above us were shining bright in the sky. It should have been perfect. But that first night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't anything obvious. No strange noises, no animals rustling in the bushes. It was just a sense of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the light of the fire. I didn't mention it to Mason. I figured it was just my nerves, or maybe the fact that I wasn't used to being so far away from the comforts of home. We sat around the fire talking about nothing in particular, the warmth of the flames keeping the cold at bay. At some point, Mason stood up stretching. "I'm going to go check out the stream," he said. "I'll be back in a minute." I nodded, watching as he disappeared into the darkness beyond the firelight. For a few minutes, I sat there alone, staring into the flames, listening to the crackle of burning wood. That's when I heard it. A soft rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. At first, I thought it was Mason coming back, but the sound was coming from the opposite direction, the trees behind me. I turned, peering into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything beyond the flickering light of the fire. "Mason!" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness of the night. No answer. The rustling stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. I felt my pulse quicken, but I told myself it was probably just an animal. There were deer in these woods, maybe even a rabbit or something. I tried to relax, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I stood up, walking over to the edge of the clearing, staring into the dark forest. The fire behind me cast long shadows across the ground, making the trees look like twisted figures reaching out from the earth. I couldn't see anything unusual, but the air felt heavy. Like something was there, just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. "Mason, this isn't funny," I called again, louder this time. I was starting to get annoyed. If he was trying to mess with me, it was working. There was a rustling sound again, closer this time, and my heart skipped a beat. I stepped back, instinctively moving closer to the fire. My eyes scanned the tree line, searching for any sign of movement, but the forest was still. And then, out of darkness, I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the trees. It was tall, too tall to be Mason, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. It stood perfectly still, its head tilted slightly as if watching me. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. I took a step back, my heart racing. "Mason?" I called again, my voice trembling. No response. I turned and ran toward the stream, my mind racing. I found Mason crouched by the water, completely unaware of what was happening. "Mason, we need to go," I said, grabbing his arm. He looked up at me, confused. "What? What's wrong?" "There's someone in the woods," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I saw someone. Something watching us." Mason stood up, frowning. "Are you sure? There's no one out here but us." "I'm telling you, I saw something," I insisted, pulling him back toward the campsite. We reached the fire, and I pointed toward the spot where I had seen the figure, but it was gone. The trees were still, the night quiet again, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left. Mason didn't seem convinced, but he agreed that we should stay close to the fire for the rest of the night. We sat there in silence for a while, both of us staring into the darkness, listening for any sign of movement, but the woods were silent. Eventually, we decided to turn in for the night. Mason crawled into the tent first, while I sat by the fire a little longer, unwilling to leave the safety of the light. The feeling of unease hadn't gone away, but I was exhausted. I finally put out the fire and climbed into the tent, hoping that sleep would come quickly. But it didn't. I lay there in the darkness, listening to Mason's steady breathing next to me, but I couldn't relax. Every sound outside the tent, every rustle of the wind, every creak of the trees, made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there watching us. And then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again. The rustling. It was louder this time, closer. I held my breath, listening. The sound was coming from just outside the tent, moving slowly around the campsite. I could hear the soft crunch of leaves underfoot, the quiet rustle of branches being brushed aside. My pulse quickened, and I reached out, shaking Mason awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. Mason groaned, half asleep. "What now?" "Shh, listen." He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and we both listened in silence. The sound was unmistakable. Someone or something was walking around the campsite. Mason grabbed the flashlight, unzipping the tent as quietly as he could. He shined the light outside, sweeping it across the trees, but there was nothing there. The rustling stopped. We waited for what felt like an eternity, but the sound didn't return. Eventually, Mason shrugged, turning off the flashlight. "It's probably just an animal," he said, lying back down. But I wasn't convinced. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that figure standing just outside the tent, watching, waiting for me to let my guard down. The next morning, we packed up and headed home. Mason didn't seem too bothered by what had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there with us. Something that wasn't just a deer or a rabbit. A few days after we got back, I started having nightmares. They were always the same. I was back in the woods, standing in the clearing, but the fire was out and the figure was there, watching me from the trees. No matter how fast I ran, I couldn't get away. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the feeling of being watched still lingering. I didn't tell anyone about the nightmares. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I knew that whatever I had seen in the woods hadn't been my imagination. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of rustling outside my window. At first, I thought I was still dreaming, but as I sat up in bed, I realized the sound was real. It was the same soft rustling I had heard in the woods, the same slow, deliberate movement. I looked out the window, my heart racing, and there it was. The figure. Standing just beyond the streetlight, its silhouette barely visible in the darkness. It was watching me, just like it had in the woods. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, waiting. I don't know how long I stared at it, but eventually I looked away for just a second, to grab my phone, to call someone, anyone. But when I looked back, the figure was gone. I haven't seen it since. But every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I still feel it, watching.